Under the flickering streetlight, Shaq adjusted his coat against the biting chill of the night, his mind occupied by the evening's charity gala. The cheers from children whose dreams he'd supported still echoed in his ears, a reminder of the hope that simple acts of kindness could ignite. He was about to step into his car when a faint voice stopped him in his tracks. "Help me, please!" The voice belonged to a frail girl, her hands trembling as she clutched a tattered blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes, hollow and sunken, locked onto his, carrying a desperation that made his chest tighten. Shaq hesitated, momentarily unsure how to react. The street was eerily quiet, the cold air sharp with the scent of rain. "Please, I don't have anywhere else to go," she stammered, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. "It's after me." Shaq furrowed his brow. "What's after you?" He crouched slightly to meet her eye level, his tone cautious yet gentle. Her lips quivered as she whispered, "It comes at night, for anyone who tries to help me. You shouldn't even be standing here." Shaq straightened, unease crawling down his spine. The words felt like the prelude to a nightmare, absurd yet unsettling. He glanced around, the dimly lit street offering no signs of danger, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Look," he said, pulling out his phone. "Let me call someone too." "No," she interrupted, clutching his arm with surprising strength for someone so fragile. "You don't understand. If you help me, it'll mark you too." Her fingers trembled as she let go, seemingly realizing her boldness. Tears welled up in her eyes as she backed away a step. "I shouldn't have come to you. I shouldn't have." Shaq sighed and took a step closer. "Hey, hold on. You're clearly in trouble, and I'm not about to walk away from that. Let me help you." Her head shook frantically, her hair a messy curtain that partially obscured her face. "You'll regret it," she muttered, almost inaudibly. A sudden, sharp gust of wind cut through the street, extinguishing the lone light above them. Shaq instinctively looked up, his pulse quickening. When he looked back down, the girl was swaying on her feet, her complexion pale as if the life were being drained from her. "What's wrong?" he asked, reaching out to steady her. "It's here," she whispered before collapsing into his arms. The air grew heavier, a suffocating stillness that sent Shaq's instincts into overdrive. He scanned the shadows, his heart pounding as he tried to shake the inexplicable sense of dread. There was no logical explanation for what he was feeling, yet it gripped him like a vice. Before he could process further, his phone buzzed. Pulling it out, he saw a notification from an unknown sender. "Walk away while you can." His throat tightened as the words seared into his mind. He glanced at the girl, unconscious but breathing shallowly, her body frail against his sturdy frame. Whatever danger she was in, it was no longer just about her. Shaq didn't waste another second. He scooped the girl into his arms and rushed to his car, his mind racing with confusion and a growing sense of urgency. As he sped toward the nearest shelter, the strange feeling that they were being followed only intensified. The streets were empty, yet the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as if unseen eyes were tracking his every move. He couldn't explain it, but the dread gnawed at him like a constant presence. The girl remained limp in his arms, her breath coming in shallow, labored gasps. He pushed the accelerator harder, his hands gripping the wheel with an intensity he couldn't control. Shaq wasn't a man who scared easily, but this was different. Something about the way the air felt, the oppressive stillness, told him he was playing with fire. When they arrived at the shelter, Shaq burst through the doors and called for help. A nurse rushed over, her face registering shock as she took in the sight of the girl. Shaq didn't explain. There wasn't time for that. He handed her off, watching as the nurse gently laid the girl on a cot and began checking her vitals. "Is she all right?" Shaq asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The nurse paused, glancing back at him with a furrowed brow. "She's alive, but there's something strange going on here. I've never seen someone so pale, so—" She trailed off, her voice faltering as if the words themselves were too difficult to say. "Her name's Leah," Shaq muttered, stepping closer. "She said she's cursed? That something's after her." The nurse turned toward him, her expression shifting from concern to something more wary. Cursed? Shaq nodded, his jaw tightening. She told me if I helped her, I'd be marked too. I thought she was out of her mind, but something's wrong. I can feel it. The nurse hesitated before speaking. There's an old legend in this town about a curse. It's not just folklore. People who've been connected to it, they disappear or worse. She shook her head, as if trying to clear her thoughts. It's crazy to even talk about. We've heard the stories, but no one's ever connected it to anyone in years. Shaq's eyes narrowed. What kind of stories? The nurse glanced over her shoulder, lowering her voice. There was a woman. Years ago. She was wronged by the town, accused of witchcraft, though she was just a healer. They killed her, burned her at the stake. But before she died, she cursed them all. Said that anyone who helped her, anyone who came too close, would be marked. That they'd be taken by something not of this world. The nurse's voice wavered as she spoke the last part, and Shaq could hear the unmistakable tremor of fear. He'd heard urban legends before, but this one felt different, too real, too close to the unsettling sensation he had when the girl first grabbed his arm. You're telling me that curse is real? Shaq asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. I don't know, the nurse replied, her face pale. But there are people who believe it is. And there are stories of people who've helped others in the past, people who disappeared. The curse spreads. It latches on to those who try to intervene. Shaq clenched his fists, frustration mixing with confusion. So what? I'm supposed to just turn my back on her? Let her die because of some curse? The nurse didn't answer immediately. She looked at Leah, still unconscious, her chest rising and falling slowly. I'm not saying you should walk away. But I am saying you should be careful. There's more to this than you know. If she's truly cursed, there's nothing we can do. The town's tried before, tried to fight it. No one's ever won. A silence stretched between them. Shaq stared at Leah, her face a pale mask of fear and exhaustion. He had to do something. He couldn't just leave her. He didn't know if he believed in curses, but he did believe in helping people, in doing what was right. If there was even the smallest chance that she could be saved, he had to take it. She told me something else, Shaq said, breaking the silence. She said the curse doesn't just target her, it targets anyone who helps her. That it takes people, one by one, until it gets to the source. The nurse's eyes widened. And you believe her? Shaq's gaze didn't waver from Leah. I don't know what I believe. But I'm not walking away. The nurse sighed, clearly torn between professional caution and the desperate need to help. She looked back at Leah, her eyes softening. I'll keep her here for now. But if things start happening, if there's a real danger, you need to be ready. Shaq nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. He didn't know what was happening, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his life, and Leah's, was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly predict. As he stepped outside, the same sense of unease gnawed at him. The streets seemed quieter than before, as if the town itself were holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Shaq looked up, the stars hidden behind a thick veil of clouds. He felt as if the curse was already beginning to take hold, as though it were only a matter of time before it would come for him too. The air grew colder as Shaq walked back into the shelter, his thoughts a tangled mess of uncertainty and fear. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a message from an unknown number. It's already started. You'll see her true nature soon. A chill ran down his spine as he read the cryptic words. He had hoped it was just some sick prank, a cruel joke from someone who knew what he was getting involved in. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. The curse was real. Whatever it was coming for them. When he returned to the room where Leah lay, the nurse was still there, but something was different. Her back was to him, and she didn't immediately turn around as he entered. It was a small thing, but it made the hairs on his neck stand on end. He approached cautiously, clearing his throat to get her attention. What's going on? She's still out cold? The nurse turned slowly, her face pale. Her eyes met his, but there was a strange look in them, a hollow recognition, as if she had seen something she couldn't unsee. She's not like the others. Shaq furrowed his brow. What do you mean? The nurse didn't answer right away. She glanced back at Leah's prone form, her eyes lingering on the girl as if she was studying her. Her heartbeat's irregular, she finally said. It's almost as if she's not fully human. But the strangest part. Shaq took a step closer. What's the strangest part? The nurse's voice dropped to a whisper. She doesn't breathe. Not the way people do. It's like her chest moves in shallow bursts, but there's no real rhythm to it. It's unnatural. Shaq felt his stomach tighten. He looked at Leah, her pale face, her frail form. He had seen her shiver earlier, her body convulsing in her sleep, but now, her stillness was far more unsettling. He knelt beside her, trying to ignore the unease creeping up his spine. You're telling me she's, what? Dead? No, the nurse replied, her eyes widening. She's alive, but it's like she's not. Like she's caught somewhere between two worlds. The room felt colder still, the air thick with tension. Shaq felt his heart pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder of how deep he was in this, how far he had already fallen into the unknown. If what the nurse said was true, if Leah wasn't entirely human, then that meant the curse wasn't just some local legend or superstition. It meant that the thing after her wasn't just some urban myth either. It was real. And it was already here. I don't care, Shaq said, standing up. I'm not leaving her. The nurse looked up, her eyes full of concern. You don't understand. This isn't just some bad luck or accident. There's a force at play here, something ancient and dangerous. It doesn't just take people, it devours them. It gets stronger with each victim. And it won't stop until it's finished. I'm not going to abandon her, Shaq said again, more firmly this time. She's not alone in this. The nurse took a step back, shaking her head slowly. You don't understand what you're up against. This curse, it's not just a curse. It's something far worse. People who've tried to help in the past, they don't just disappear. They become part of it. Part of the force that takes her. Shaq's mind reeled. He couldn't wrap his head around it. It sounded like something out of a horror movie, something that shouldn't even exist in the real world. But everything, the messages, the strange happenings, the fear in the nurse's eyes, it all pointed to the same conclusion: the curse was alive, and it was after him now. He looked back at Leah, her fragile form still unmoving on the bed. She was a girl trapped between two worlds, a girl marked by something he couldn't understand. He had to help her. No matter the cost. He stood there for a moment, weighing his options. If he left, the curse would follow him, and Leah would be left to face it alone. But if he stayed, he risked becoming its next victim. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, but there was no turning back now. He had made his choice. We need to figure out how to break the curse, Shaq said, his voice low and determined. There has to be a way. I'm not just going to let this thing take us. The nurse nodded slowly, her expression resigned. There are stories, but no one's ever figured out how to stop it. The only thing that's ever worked, if you can call it that, is when someone sacrifices themselves. Shaq's eyes narrowed. Sacrifice themselves? She nodded. The curse is fed by fear, by pain. The more someone resists it, the stronger it becomes. The only way to stop it is to give yourself to it. Become a part of it. But even then... Shaq's stomach twisted. Even then? Even then, no one knows for sure. People who've made the sacrifice disappear. No one's come back to say if it works. Shaq's jaw clenched. The thought of offering himself to this malevolent force was terrifying, but it was the only option left. He couldn't stand by and watch Leah, or anyone else, fall victim to this curse. He turned back to the nurse. Where do we start? She hesitated, then motioned for him to follow her. As he walked behind her, Shaq's mind raced with the implications. He didn't know what he was walking into, but there was no turning back now. Shaq's pulse raced as he followed the nurse down the dimly lit corridor. The air seemed to thicken with every step, pressing down on his chest as if the very building itself were holding its breath. His mind buzzed with questions and uncertainty, but there was no turning back now. Leah's curse had been placed on him the moment he decided to help her, and there was no escaping it. He was in this, whether he wanted to be or not. The nurse led him into a small, sparsely furnished room at the back of the shelter. It smelled faintly of incense and old books. Shaq couldn't help but feel that he had just walked into some kind of makeshift sanctuary, one that might hold the answers he was desperately seeking, or at least some form of clarity. "You might want to sit down," the nurse said quietly, her voice strained with the weight of the situation. She motioned to an old wooden chair in the corner of the room. Shaq stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. It felt wrong. Like everything in it was deliberately placed to create a sense of unease. But he had no choice but to trust her, at least for now. He sat down, his muscles tense, ready for whatever she had to say. "I don't know if I can help you," the nurse began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can give you some context. The curse that's tied to Leah, it's ancient. It's not something that's bound by the rules of the world we know. It's tied to a force beyond our understanding. The legend says that the one who helps her, whether willingly or not, becomes its next victim. And the more they resist, the more powerful it becomes. It doesn't stop until it has claimed them all." Shaq listened intently, his body still tense. He had heard pieces of this before, but hearing it spoken aloud, in such a cold, detached way, sent a shiver down his spine. The nurse wasn't scared of the curse, she was terrified of it. And that fear was contagious. "I don't care about the legend," Shaq said firmly. "I'm not going to let her die, and I'm not going to just walk away. What's the point of knowing all this if there's no way to stop it?" The nurse hesitated, and for the first time, Shaq saw her doubt. "The truth is, I don't know if there is a way to stop it. No one's ever come close. The curse is relentless, and the more you fight it, the more it takes. People have tried to help others like Leah, but they always end up part of it. No one's ever come back." Shaq clenched his fists, the frustration of being powerless gnawing at him. "Then I'll be the first to come back." The nurse looked at him, her expression softening. "I admire your determination, but this isn't something you can fight head-on. You'll need to understand it first. You need to know what it is, what it wants. Only then will you stand a chance." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. It looked ancient, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. She placed it on the table in front of him. "This book," the nurse said, her voice laced with reverence, "was passed down through generations. It contains what we know about the curse and the entity behind it. It's not much, but it's all we have." Shaq picked up the book, feeling the weight of it in his hands. It was cold to the touch, as though it carried with it the essence of the very curse he was now fighting. He opened the first page, scanning the worn, faded words. They were written in a language he didn't recognize, but the more he looked at them, the more they seemed to make sense. It was as if the words were drawing him in, pulling him deeper into their meaning. "The entity," the nurse continued, "is ancient. It's not bound by the same rules we are. It thrives on fear and suffering, feeding off the souls of those it touches. It can twist reality, make you question what's real, until you no longer know where the curse ends and your own thoughts begin." Shaq felt a sense of dread settle over him as the words seemed to sink in. It was one thing to hear about a curse, but another thing entirely to know it was real, and that it was already taking hold of him. The book described the entity as something more than a curse. It was an almost sentient force, one that sought out the weak, the desperate, the ones who would help others. It thrived on their willingness to sacrifice. "What's the connection to Leah?" Shaq asked, his voice hoarse with the weight of the question. The nurse hesitated, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Leah, she's not just a victim. She's the key. The entity feeds off her, yes, but it also uses her. She's been marked since she was a child. The curse is tied to her bloodline. Every generation, one of them is chosen, and they become the vessel for the entity's power. But it's not just a passive curse. Leah, she can call it, control it, to some extent. She can influence it, but only if she chooses to. If she doesn't, it will take everything from her. And from anyone who tries to save her. Shaq's heart sank as the implications of the nurse's words hit him. Leah wasn't just cursed, she was a part of the curse. She had the power to summon the very thing that was hunting them. And she didn't even know it. So what now? Shaq asked, his voice steady despite the growing panic inside him. The nurse met his gaze, her expression grim. You'll need to find a way to break the bond between her and the entity. If you can sever that connection, the curse will lose its hold. But be warned, if you fail, you'll become part of it. The entity will consume you, just as it has consumed so many others. Shaq's mind raced. The curse, the entity, it was all so much to process, but there was no time to think. Leah's life was hanging in the balance, and the only way to save her, and himself, was to confront the darkness head-on. The nurse had given him the knowledge, the tools, but it was up to him to take the next step. To fight, no matter the cost. Where do I start? He asked, his voice resolute. The nurse didn't answer immediately. She looked at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, it was with a strange sense of finality. You start with her. Find the source of her power. Only then will you be able to break the curse. Shaq walked out of the nurse's room, the weight of her words pressing on him. The air felt thicker, more oppressive, as if the curse itself was clinging to him, trying to pull him into its grasp. His thoughts raced, each step taking him deeper into the labyrinth of uncertainty that now enveloped his life. Leah was the key. But what did that mean? And how could he possibly break something as ancient and powerful as this curse? His mind replayed the nurse's warning. The curse had consumed everyone who had tried to stop it. No one had ever returned. And yet, here he was, ready to face the very thing that had taken so many lives. Was it courage, or sheer stubbornness, that drove him forward? Maybe it was both. He found Leah sitting on the edge of a worn-out bed, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as he entered, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and fear. Relief that he was still here, fear of what he might soon face. You're still here, Leah whispered, almost as if she couldn't believe it. I didn't think you'd come back. Shaq gave her a reassuring nod, though his heart was heavy with the weight of everything he had learned. I'm not going anywhere until this is over. Leah's eyes searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt. But she didn't find it. Instead, she seemed to sag with an air of resignation. It's not just a curse, you know. It's a punishment. Shaq froze. A punishment? What do you mean? She hesitated, swallowing hard before continuing. My family, they made a deal. A long time ago. And I was born into it. The curse was passed down through the generations. I didn't ask for this. I never asked for any of it. Shaq's mind spun, trying to process her words. What deal? What are you talking about? Leah's voice cracked as she spoke. My ancestors, they made a pact with the entity. They thought they could control it, use its power for their own gain. But the entity is not something that can be controlled. It was never meant to be. And now, the curse has been passed down to me. I didn't ask for it. I didn't want it. But it's mine now. And every time someone tries to help me, they become its next victim. Shaq took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. So that's why you've been running? That's why you've been hiding? Leah nodded slowly. I thought if I stayed away from everyone, kept to myself, maybe the curse would pass me by. But I was wrong. The entity doesn't care about distance. It's a part of me now, no matter where I go. Shaq's heart ached for her, but he didn't back down. So, what do we do now? Leah wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. I don't know. I've tried everything, prayers, rituals, even trying to cut myself off from my past. But nothing works. The curse always finds me. And it always takes someone. Shaq's mind raced. The weight of what she was saying was unbearable, but he refused to let fear dictate his next move. If there was even a chance to break the curse, to free Leah from its grip, he had to try. There has to be something. You're not the one who made the deal, right? You're not responsible for it. Leah's eyes darkened. It doesn't matter. The entity doesn't care about who made the deal. It doesn't care about guilt or innocence. It just takes. And if you're close to me, it takes from you too. Shaq exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Then I guess I'll have to get closer. The nurse said the curse is tied to you, that you're the key. If we break that connection, the curse will lose its power. But how do we even begin to understand it? How do we break something like this? Leah looked down, a sense of defeat clouding her features. I don't know. I've tried everything. But maybe you're right. Maybe there's a way to stop it. Shaq's resolve hardened. We'll find a way. We just need to figure out what it is, and then destroy it. Leah's eyes flickered with a mix of hope and fear. You don't understand. The curse isn't something that can just be destroyed. It's not that simple. Shaq stepped closer, taking her hand in his. Then we figure it out together. You're not alone in this. Not anymore. For the first time, Leah allowed herself a small, fragile smile. But it quickly faded as she looked around the room, as if she could feel the weight of the curse closing in on them both. I wish I could believe you. But I've seen people try to fight it before. They all end up consumed. No one wins. Shaq squeezed her hand, refusing to let her give up. Then I'll be the first. I'm not backing down. Not for you, not for me. We're going to beat this. Leah stared at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with confusion and wonder. But how? Shaq looked down at the ground, his mind racing. I don't know yet. But I'm not going to stop until I figure it out. I'll learn everything there is to know about this entity, about the curse, and I'll find a way to destroy it. Leah blinked, the disbelief slowly giving way to something else, something that looked like trust, a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. You really think you can? Shaq nodded. I don't just think it. I know it. For a moment, there was silence between them, as if the world had stopped spinning. Leah squeezed his hand, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe, truly believe, that there might be a way out. The curse might be powerful, but Shaq was determined to break it, no matter the cost. As they sat there in the quiet room, the tension between them was palpable, but so was the unspoken promise. The promise of a fight that would challenge everything they thought they knew about fear, survival, and courage. And whatever came next, they would face it together. Shaq stood at the edge of the abandoned church, his mind racing with a million thoughts. Leah was right beside him, her presence heavy with the weight of everything they had discovered. The silence of the night felt suffocating, and the air seemed to vibrate with an energy he couldn't understand. The entity was close, he could feel it. But so was Leah's fate, and with it, his own. We're here, Shaq muttered, his voice steady despite the unease that gripped him. Now we find a way to stop this. Leah looked around, her eyes scanning the shadowed edges of the church. The building had once been full of life, but now it was hollow, the windows cracked, and the floors creaked with every step they took. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. This place, it's where it all began. Where they made the deal. Shaq turned to her, the determination in his eyes unwavering. And we're going to end it here. Together. Leah glanced at him, her face a mix of disbelief and hope. You don't get it, Shaq. This isn't a fight we can win. This place is cursed. The entity is tied to it. If we're here, we're already marked. Shaq clenched his fists, the thought of losing to something he couldn't even see fueling his resolve. Then we do what we have to do. We break the connection. We find the source of this thing and end it, no matter what. Leah took a shaky breath. It's not that simple. The curse, it's tied to blood, to generations of deals. You don't just walk in and break it. It's a part of me. A part of my family. Shaq took a step toward her, his voice softer. You said it yourself, you didn't ask for this. You're not responsible for what your family did. And that means you don't have to carry this burden anymore. Leah looked away, her face filled with conflict. But how can I let it go? How can I live with the knowledge that I was born into something so dark? Shaq shook his head. It's not about what you were born into. It's about who you choose to be now. You don't have to let it define you. For a long moment, Leah didn't speak. She just stood there, looking at the old church, the weight of her past pressing down on her. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. I want to believe you. I really do. But I don't know how. Shaq stepped up to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Then let me show you. We'll find a way, Leah. I'm not going anywhere. They stood there in the eerie silence, the weight of their task heavy between them. But there was a quiet strength in Shaq's words, something that made Leah feel like there might still be hope. Despite everything, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this time things would be different. As they moved deeper into the church, the air grew colder, the shadows darker. Shaq could feel the presence of the entity, lurking just beyond their reach. It wasn't something he could see, but it was something he could feel, a gnawing, oppressive presence that seemed to be watching them, waiting for the moment to strike. Leah led the way toward the altar, her movements hesitant, as though she were walking into her own doom. This is where they made the deal. It's where it all started. Shaq's gaze hardened. And it's where it will end. He stepped forward, scanning the room for any sign of what they were looking for. A moment passed, and then he spotted it, an old, worn book lying on the altar, its pages yellowed with age. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against the leather cover. The moment he touched it, a surge of cold shot through his body, and he felt a presence, that malevolent, suffocating presence, slam into him, as if the entity were trying to consume him. Shaq staggered back, barely catching his balance. Leah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she looked at him in horror. It's too late. It knows we're here. It's already taken you. Shaq gritted his teeth, shaking off the disorienting wave of fear that threatened to overwhelm him. I'm not letting it win. He reached for the book again, this time gripping it tightly. The moment he opened the cover, a low, growling voice echoed through the church, a sound that was more felt than heard, something ancient and dark. It filled the air, vibrating through his bones, making the walls tremble with power. Leah's voice cracked as she whispered, The curse, it's tied to the book. It's how they summoned it. If we destroy it, we destroy the curse. Shaq nodded grimly. Then let's destroy it. With a swift motion, Shaq tore the book in half. The moment he did, a blast of energy exploded from the pages, throwing him and Leah across the room. The force of it was like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of them both. When Shaq's vision cleared, he saw the figure. It was tall, dark, and shadowy, its features barely discernible as it loomed over them. The entity had come for them, its form pulsating with a sickening, otherworldly glow. Leah gasped, her body trembling. It's here. It's come to finish us off. Shaq stood, his body bruised but unbroken. No. We finish it. The entity let out a low, guttural growl, its dark tendrils reaching for them, its presence suffocating. Shaq took a deep breath, every inch of him focused on the battle ahead. He had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was clear, he wasn't going down without a fight. You want me? Shaq shouted, his voice steady and defiant. You'll have to go through me first. Leah, standing beside him, found her own courage rising. She gritted her teeth, her voice fierce. And me? The entity hesitated for a split second, its form flickering. Shaq saw an opening, a chance to end this. He lunged forward, his fists pounding into the entity's shadowy form. Each strike seemed to push it back, but it kept reforming, its dark essence swirling and reforming like smoke. Shaq could feel his strength waning, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not now. Not when they were so close to the end. The entity recoiled as Shaq's blows landed, but it wasn't defeated yet. The darkness seemed to pulse around them, feeding off their energy, drawing strength from the fear that had begun to creep in. Shaq's breath came in heavy gasps, but he didn't let up. Every punch was a statement, a defiance against the centuries-old curse that had taken hold of Leah's life. Leah stood beside him, her hands clenched into fists, her eyes burning with the same determination. "We can't let it win," she muttered, her voice shaky but fierce. "We break the curse here. We end it." Shaq nodded, his mind racing for a plan. They were both running on fumes, and the entity was relentless. It moved in ways that defied logic, its shadowy forms shifting and flickering like smoke. But Shaq had something the creature didn't: resolve. He wasn't about to let some ancient force take everything from him, from Leah. With a grunt, Shaq shoved his body forward, pushing through the darkness. The entity screeched, a sound so deafening that Shaq's ears rang. He stumbled but stayed on his feet, his eyes scanning the room for any advantage. He couldn't fight it with strength alone. He needed something more. Leah's voice broke through the noise, her tone sharp. "The altar!" She pointed toward the ancient stone slab, now cracked and weathered, its carvings barely visible. "It's part of the curse. We have to destroy it." Shaq's eyes locked onto the altar. It was old, older than anything he had ever seen, and it had been the center of all the suffering in this place. If they destroyed it, they could break the curse. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed Leah's arm and pulled her toward the altar, his body aching, the force of the entity's presence pushing against them. The shadows writhed around them, but they pressed on, determined. The entity, now enraged, reached for them with its dark tendrils, the air thick with its malevolent force. "Stay close," Shaq growled, as he pulled Leah toward the altar. His hand tightened around hers, the cold air swirling around them. "We're almost there." They reached the altar, but the entity was not done. With a roar, it surged forward, a mass of swirling darkness that seemed to consume everything in its path. Shaq braced himself, standing between Leah and the entity, determined to protect her at all costs. But Leah wasn't about to stand by. She stepped forward, her voice loud and resolute. "You won't win. We're taking back our lives." Her words echoed through the church, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something, weakness, perhaps. The entity hesitated, as though it was caught off guard by the strength in her voice. Shaq didn't waste the opportunity. He lifted a heavy stone from the altar, using all his remaining strength to smash it onto the cracked surface. The moment the stone hit, the church seemed to quake. The entity screeched again, its form beginning to unravel. The shadows that had once seemed impenetrable now faded, as though the force holding them together was weakening. Shaq could see it, the entity's power unraveling with every strike, every blow to the altar. "Keep going!" Leah shouted, her voice full of urgency. "We can do this!" Shaq, his hands slick with sweat and blood, didn't stop. He kept hammering at the altar, smashing stone upon stone. The cracks deepened, the dark force surrounding them flickering, like it was dying. With every strike, Shaq could feel the curse lifting, feel the weight on his chest easing. The fear that had haunted them both was slowly slipping away. The entity, now writhing and howling in pain, tried one last desperate attempt to claw its way back. But it was too late. The altar shattered with a deafening crack, the final blow landing just as the last vestiges of the darkness dissolved into nothingness. For a moment, everything was still. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the church lifted, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Shaq's chest heaved as he caught his breath, his body trembling with exhaustion, but there was a strange calm in the air now. Leah collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking as the realization of what had just happened hit her. "It's over," she whispered, her voice a mix of relief and disbelief. "We did it." Shaq knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. He didn't say anything at first. There were no words needed. They had just faced something unimaginable, and they had come out the other side. It was over. "We did," Shaq said, his voice quiet but firm. "We're free." Leah looked up at him, her face still streaked with tears, but there was a new light in her eyes. The fear that had once consumed her was gone, replaced by a quiet strength she hadn't known she had. I don't know what to say. I never thought I'd be free from it. You don't have to say anything, Shaq replied. You're free now. And that's all that matters. They sat there for a long moment, the weight of what they had just accomplished sinking in. The entity was gone, the curse broken, and the fear that had gripped Leah's life for so long was nothing more than a memory. It had taken everything to get here, but they had done it. Together. As the night air began to cool, Shaq helped Leah to her feet. There was still a long road ahead, but now, they could walk it without the burden of the past hanging over them. They had won, and in doing so, they had reclaimed their futures. There was no turning back now. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Leah allowed herself to breathe. The past had been erased, and the future was hers to shape. No more fear. No more shadows. Just the promise of a new beginning. As the last remnants of the dark energy dissolved into the air, Shaq and Leah stood in the center of the once menacing church, now eerily calm. The weight of what they had just overcome pressed down on them, but there was also a sense of liberation. The curse was broken, the malevolent entity vanquished, and for the first time in a long while, Leah felt a true sense of peace. Shaq took a slow breath, his chest still rising and falling heavily from the exertion of the battle. His body ached, bruised from the supernatural fight that had drained everything from him, but there was no regret. Every ounce of energy he had poured into protecting Leah, into breaking the curse, had been worth it. He could feel it in the air. The oppressive, heavy presence was gone. It was quiet now, free of the entity's darkness. Leah's hands trembled as she wiped away the remaining tears that stained her face. She looked at Shaq, her gaze intense, but no longer filled with the terror that had once haunted her. She smiled, albeit weakly, but the relief was undeniable. I don't even know how to thank you. You didn't have to help me. You didn't have to face that thing for me, but you did. Shaq shook his head, his voice firm but gentle. No thanks needed. I wasn't going to leave you to face that alone. I knew we could do it. You're stronger than you think, Leah. She nodded, still processing everything that had happened. The weight of the curse had been lifted, but what lay ahead? Could she ever fully escape the trauma of the years spent under its grip? Would she ever be able to truly let go? Shaq could see the doubt in her eyes. He knew that breaking the curse was only the beginning. The emotional scars, the years of torment and fear, would take time to heal. But they had won today. They had taken down an ancient force, and in doing so, they had taken back Leah's future. He wasn't going to let her face that future alone. They were in this together, now more than ever. Leah looked around, her eyes tracing the shattered altar that had once served as the focal point of the curse. The remnants of the entity's power seemed to have been absorbed into the broken stone, leaving nothing but the lingering traces of its malevolence. It's over, she whispered, as if she couldn't quite believe it. It's over, Shaq repeated, his tone steady and resolute. He looked out through the broken windows, seeing the first light of dawn creeping across the horizon. The darkness had been replaced by the soft glow of a new day. The future was theirs to shape. And for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, it was bright. Leah took a deep breath, her eyes closing briefly as the weight of the moment hit her. The curse had controlled her life for so long. It had dictated her every decision, every relationship, every step she had taken. Now it was gone, and she was free to make her own choices. She could decide who she wanted to be, what her life would look like going forward. The possibilities felt overwhelming, but also liberating. She turned to Shaq, her voice steady now, filled with a renewed sense of purpose. I never thought I'd get out. I thought it was going to be my life, being hunted, running, always looking over my shoulder. I thought the curse would never end. Shaq met her gaze, his own eyes filled with understanding. I know. But look at us now. We made it through. You're free, Leah. You can finally start living for you. She nodded, her smile growing more genuine, her heart lighter than it had been in years. I've never been more ready. For the first time in my life, I feel like I have control over my own fate. Shaq's voice softened, the weight of the moment settling in. You always had control, Leah. You just needed to see it for yourself. Her smile deepened, and she stepped closer to him. She didn't need to say anything. Words weren't necessary. What they had gone through together, what they had fought for, was more than enough. The bond they had formed in the face of the supernatural, in the face of terror and death, was unspoken but undeniable. You're right, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't see it before, but I see it now. The silence that followed was not one of emptiness but of profound understanding. There was no more darkness hanging over them, no more fear lurking in the shadows. They had faced the impossible and come out on the other side, stronger and more united than ever. As they stood there, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the broken church windows, it felt as though the world was beginning anew. Shaq and Leah had faced down the curse, defeated an ancient evil, and had done so together. There was no turning back. They had rewritten their story. Shaq turned toward the door, his hand resting on Leah's shoulder. We've got a long road ahead of us, he said, but we'll take it one step at a time. You don't have to do it alone anymore. Leah looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and determination. We'll face whatever comes next. Together. And with that, they stepped into the light of a new day, a new future, where the past no longer had the power to dictate their lives. The curse was broken, and with it, a new chapter began, one where they could both live, grow, and move forward, unburdened by the darkness that had once consumed them. It was their time now. Time to build a future of their own. Together.